Welcome to the Inside Story. I'm Billy Hollowell, and today we're talking about Evangelicals for Harris. We're going to get into all of that and a little bit more of who that group is, what they stand for. And I'm joined today by the Christian Post's John Brown. How you doing?
Good, Billy. How are you?
Well, I am doing well. You have been covering a lot of fascinating stories. One of them has surrounded, and we'll get into the more specific elements around Billy Graham's granddaughter, but it has surrounded Evangelicals for Harris, this political group, this faith group that has risen up in the past month and a half or so, getting a lot of attention. For those who don't know, what is Evangelicals for Harris and who's behind the movement?
Right. So, Evangelicals for Harris, it's a political action committee, and obviously they're trying to get siphon some of the evangelical vote for Harris that would typically go to Trump. You know, a lot of progressives are in this group. A lot of progressive pastors. It was actually founded by Reverend Jim Ball, who's a progressive pastor in the D.C. area, and he's been outspoken for years about global warming, which, of course, is one of the big issues of their platform. And other issues that they're focusing on include, things like healthcare, poverty, so-called economic justice, the buzzwords that they typically focus on.
Yeah, and it's interesting because obviously the evangelical movement has always been much more tied to the so-called right, the Christian right? And that's because most Christians tend to be more conservative and they're going to vote generally and based on polling. And of course we have to be careful with this, but even if you say Christians more broadly, it's 51%, so it's the majority saying that they're going to vote for the Republican candidate usually, or at least lean in that direction. When you look at this movement and you look at what is going on, what prospects do you think they have, Evangelicals for Harris, of actually shifting the evangelical vote more towards Harris?
I think that's hard to predict, but more than 80% of white evangelicals voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020. So they definitely have their work cut out for them. My gut says they probably won't move the needle very much. I just think because the policies that Harris supports are so at odds with a lot of what most evangelicals believe, especially on issues like abortion, which I think is probably the biggest issue for a lot of evangelicals. And I think a lot are also alarmed at how the DOJ seems to have been going after Christians under her administration.
Yeah, and you have the gender issue, which is rising up, I think, in many quarters to not necessarily rival the abortion issue, but it's definitely falling a close second for a lot of people concerned on the social issue front of what's going on in this country right now. Now, Billy Graham's granddaughter, and this is obviously any family member of Billy Graham, whatever they're doing when it comes to political endorsements, gets a lot of attention. But one of his granddaughters recently endorsed Harris for president and has been involved to some degree in Evangelicals for Harris. Can you talk a little bit about that and what her reasoning was?
Right. Jerushah Duford, she is the daughter of Billy Graham's oldest daughter. So she appeared on a public Zoom chat for the evangelical group a few weeks ago. She was among many other people who spoke. But she brought up the old accusations that Trump bragged about assaulting women in the Access Hollywood tape. Also went through the January 6th stuff we keep hearing about. She also, mentioned his 34 felony counts in the E. Jean Carroll case as well. Uh, but ultimately, she said that she's afraid Christians supporting Trump are hurting their witness for Christ. And she claims that she has seen many people turn away from Christianity because of Donald Trump.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. And obviously I'm assuming she appealed to scripture in making her case, right? So what were some of the Bible verses or stories that she appealed to as she was explaining why she had made this decision?
Well, she actually quoted Isaiah 130, and that verse says, "You shall be like an oak whose leaf withers, and like a garden without water." And her implication, of course, is that Christians who support Trump are similar. But what's ironic is if you read that verse in context, Isaiah is clearly referring to the sacred groves where the Israelites would worship false gods, and historically, a lot of times that would involve sexual immorality, child sacrifice. So I think you can actually make the case that a lot of those verses in that chapter could apply to a lot of the Democratic Party's platform on things like abortion and, as you mentioned, like the gender sexual issues.
Yeah, well, it's so here's the thing. When you see something like this come about, I always find it fascinating because people will sort of say, "Oh my goodness, one of Billy Graham's family members is, switching sides or moving over and they're endorsing, and that happens in life. People change their minds. But is this the first time that she's advocated for more progressive causes, or is this more in line with the things that she has said or done in the past, right? Has there been a shift, or is this endorsement really essentially par for the course for her?
Yeah, she's been outspoken several times in the Trump era. She came out in 2020 in support of an organization that advocates same-sex marriage for evangelicals. In 2020, she urged Christian women to reject Trump and said that the church is honoring Trump before God. She accused Trump of tear gassing protesters in Lafayette Park that summer of 2020, which of course was found to be false. And then she just basically accuses Trump of hijacking the Christian faith. She signed a letter blaming the January 6th riot on Christian nationalism, which again is a spurious claim, I think. And she just overall is setting herself in the line against the MAGA Christians.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a divided time in this country right now, and I mean, we're always divided, but I think this has been a very unique time, and the next 2 months are going to be tough and difficult and painful for a lot of individuals and families, who have disagreement. And what's interesting about the Graham family is there's definitely some disagreement. In fact, her uncle Franklin Graham has had some things to say publicly. What is he saying about Trump and the election and politics more generally?
Well, Franklin, of course, has long been a vocal Trump supporter. He has claimed that Trump was his father's last vote in 2016 before he died a couple years later. He said, and he maintains that Trump is the best reflection of the conservative values that his father held, and that would not have changed if he were alive today. But he's especially upset with the Evangelicals for Harris because they cut an ad using one of his dad's sermons. In the sermon, Graham had asked the audience if they had ever been to the cross to ask forgiveness. And then they showed a clip of Trump being asked that in 2015. And he said, "No, I don't think so." Something to that effect, which he later backtracked on. But he was very upset. Franklin was very upset that they used that because that was not the reason for that sermon. And he was saying that it was a misleading use of that, as if to imply that, his father and Trump would be at odds today. So
Wow.
it sounds very complicated, a lot of family drama for sure.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate when that happens around politics. So, just as we close this out, what is your prediction for what happens next with the Evangelicals for Harris? Because the election is in full bloom, and they're out there on social media. They're out there. They've hosted at least one of these events now. What do you think happens next?
Well, I think they're going to keep doing what they've been doing. They're running another ad now on various digital platforms that features Kamala Harris talking about her beliefs. They called the ad "Fruits of the Spirit." I'm not sure if that's the most appropriate title, but they're also doing some work with local activists to hold in-person events in swing states. So they're going to try their best to get the evangelical vote. But as I said, I just think most evangelicals are going to find it very hard to reconcile their faith with the extreme abortion views of the Harris-Walz ticket.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we'll continue to track all of this and have you back on to explain it as new details unfold. John, appreciate your time today.
Sure, Billy. Thank you.
Everyone else, make sure you head on over to the Christian Post. You can read the story that we talked about today. We'll have it in the show notes and many others over at christianpost.com. And John, we'll see you again very soon.
All right. Bye.